In December 1982, in the city of Melbourne, Australia, a baby boy entered the world. But unlike most babies, he did not bring only cries of joy. Instead, his arrival filled the hospital room with shock, silence, and confusion. The doctors and nurses stood still, staring at the newborn with disbelief in their eyes. He had been born without arms and without legs, a condition so rare that even the most experienced doctors could not find the right words to comfort his parents. The disorder was called tetraamelia syndrome, and it meant that their child would live his entire life without limbs. His mother wept uncontrollably, his father stood speechless, and the family was struck with a wave of emotions they could not explain. They were prepared to welcome a healthy child into their arms, but instead they were handed a life that seemed to come only with obstacles, pain, and endless questions. The baby was given the name Nick Vujicic. From the very first day of his life, people around him whispered doubts about what kind of future he could ever have. How could a child without arms and legs feed himself? How could he walk, play, or grow into a man who could work, provide, and survive in the world? Every glance, every sigh, and every hushed conversation in the hospital echoed the same thought: this child will never live a normal life. His parents, though filled with love, could not deny the deep fear that settled into their hearts. They worried that Nick would face a lifetime of rejection, loneliness, and dependence. And at that moment, even they did not see the extraordinary destiny that waited quietly within their little boy. As days turned into months, his parents tried to treat him as normally as possible. They learned to adjust to his needs, to lift him, feed him, and care for him in ways most parents never had to think about. They made a promise to give him love, even if the world never would. Yet deep inside, the pain of knowing that their child was different never truly left them. They knew the journey ahead would be one of challenges, heartbreaks, and struggles they could not yet imagine. While other parents dreamt of their children becoming doctors, athletes, or leaders, Nick's parents feared their child might not even survive the hardships of growing up. For Nick, his childhood began with limitations already surrounding him like invisible walls. He could not crawl across the floor like other babies. He could not reach out to grab toys with little hands because he had none. He could not take his first steps because his legs simply did not exist. He had only a small foot-like limb with 2 toes, and though it looked like nothing more than a reminder of what he was missing, one day it would become his greatest tool. But as a baby, no one saw it that way. They only saw what he lacked. The early years were not only a struggle for Nick but also for his parents, who constantly faced people's questions and stares. They were asked why God had given them a child like this. They were told to prepare themselves for a hard life, and some even suggested that Nick might never amount to anything. It was not only society's cruelty that hurt but also the silent burden of uncertainty they carried as a family. Every day seemed like a test of patience and faith. Yet, in those silent moments of fear, there was also a spark of hope. His parents decided that they would not give up on him. They would raise him with love, teach him courage, and show him that he was not worthless, even if the world thought so. They did not know how far Nick could go in life, but they refused to let him be treated as less than human. They gave him the one thing he needed most, a chance. And though Nick was too young to understand it then, the story of his life was already being written, a story that would one day travel across the world and inspire millions of hearts. Nick's beginning was different, painful, and filled with questions, but it was also the foundation of something far greater. His life started with what looked like nothing but weakness, yet hidden within that weakness was a strength that would grow, flourish, and shine brighter than anyone could have ever imagined. From the very moment of his birth, Nick Vujicic's life carried a powerful truth: sometimes the most broken beginnings can lead to the most unbreakable lives. As Nick began to grow, the challenges of his condition became more visible and more painful. While other children took their first steps, Nick could only watch. When toddlers reached out with tiny fingers to grab toys or food, Nick could not. He had no arms to stretch out, no legs to balance on. All he had was his small chicken drumstick foot, as he sometimes jokingly called it later in life. But as a child, that limb did not feel like a blessing. It felt like a reminder of everything he did not have. Each morning when he woke up, his limitations stared back at him before the day even began. And every night, as he lay in bed, he could not escape the thought that he was different, and that difference made him feel trapped in a world built for everyone else. Nick's parents tried to give him as normal a life as possible. His father encouraged him to be strong, while his mother pushed him to try new things. They did not want to raise him with pity, because they believed pity would weaken him even more. Instead, they challenged him to learn independence in small ways. His mother taught him to brush his teeth with the help of his toes. His father cheered him on as he figured out how to use his foot to push himself upright or balance his body in a chair. These were tiny victories, but they required enormous patience and determination. Every small achievement felt like climbing a mountain, and every failure felt like falling back into the valley of despair. School, however, was where the weight of his struggles grew heavier. Classrooms were not designed for a child like Nick. He could not hold a pen in the way others did. He could not participate in games during breaks or run across the playground with his classmates. Instead, he often sat on the sidelines, watching others enjoy the freedom his body denied him. Children, with their unfiltered honesty, did not hide their curiosity or cruelty. Some stared at him as if he were an alien. Others laughed, mocked, or whispered behind his back. A few even dared to say out loud what Nick already feared in his heart, that he would never be able to do anything, that his life had no meaning, that he was destined to be dependent on others forever. For a young boy, these words were heavy, far too heavy. They pressed on Nick's soul like a stone that grew heavier every year. He began to ask questions that no child should ever have to ask. Why me? Why was I born this way? Why can't I be like everyone else? Did God forget me? The world around him seemed to scream that he was incomplete, broken, and useless. And the more he listened, the more those voices echoed inside his heart. At home, his parents continued to remind him that he was loved, that he had value, and that his life mattered. But as much as their words comforted him, they could not erase the daily pain of being different. Nick could not escape the reality that his future looked uncertain. How could he ever work without hands? How could he ever travel, marry, or build a family without arms and legs? These questions haunted him. He saw his friends dream of becoming doctors, teachers, or athletes, while he feared his life might be limited to loneliness and dependency. And yet, even in these heavy years of childhood, something quiet began to grow inside Nick. Beneath the pain, beneath the doubt, there was a small seed of determination planted by his parents' constant love and encouragement. He did not yet know how, but a part of him began to believe that maybe, just maybe, his life could still have a purpose. He began experimenting with what he could do instead of only thinking about what he couldn't. He practiced typing with his toes, he learned to balance his body, and he discovered ways to adapt. They were small beginnings, but they were steps toward a future he could not yet imagine. Nick's childhood was not filled with the joys of playgrounds and games, it was filled with silent battles, invisible scars, and endless questions. But it was also the training ground for a resilience that would later shock the world. Each struggle, each rejection, and each tear built the foundation for the man who would one day stand on stages across continents. Though the weight of childhood struggles pressed heavily on him, it also shaped him, molding him into a vessel of strength, patience, and courage. What seemed like a broken life in those early years was in fact preparing him for a destiny far greater than anyone could see. As Nick entered school life more deeply, the battle inside him became harder. School was supposed to be a place of learning, fun, and friendship, but for Nick, it often felt like a battlefield where his difference was noticed before anything else. His teachers did their best to support him, adapting lessons so that he could participate, but children can be brutally honest. They stared, they whispered, and some of them laughed. To them, Nick looked strange. He had no arms to raise during class, no legs to run with during sports, and no normal way to join in their games. And children, in their innocence or their cruelty, made sure he knew it. Every day, Nick faced comments that dug deep into his heart. Some classmates called him names, others mocked him, and many avoided him altogether. At recess, when the playground came alive with laughter and movement, Nick often sat on the side, watching the other children climb, jump, and play tag. He longed to join them, but he could not. The laughter of others sometimes felt like knives cutting into his loneliness. Instead of hearing joy, he heard reminders of everything he could not do. And while most children looked forward to school, Nick sometimes dreaded it, knowing it meant another day of stares, whispers, and isolation. The bullying did not just come in words, it came in silence too. The silence of being left out of groups. The silence of sitting alone while everyone else had friends to talk to. The silence of being invisible, yet painfully visible all at once. These moments carved wounds into Nick's heart that no bandage could cover. He began to feel that he did not belong anywhere, that maybe the world had no place for someone like him. And these feelings of rejection did not disappear when the school bell rang. They followed him home, filling his nights with sadness and his mornings with dread. Nick tried to smile through the pain. He tried to act as though the words and laughter did not hurt him, but deep down, every cruel remark became a heavy stone added to the weight he was already carrying. By the time he was just a young boy, he was carrying a mountain of insecurities, doubts, and fears. He began to believe the lies spoken over him, that he was worthless, that he would never achieve anything, that his life had no meaning. And the more he believed those lies, the darker his world became. His parents continued to encourage him. They reminded him that he was loved, that his life was not a mistake, and that God had a plan for him. But even love at home could not fully erase the sting of rejection outside. Nick wanted to believe his parents, but the voices of the bullies were louder in his head. Every insult echoed over and over, drowning out the whispers of hope. And slowly, Nick began to wonder if there was any point in living at all. The cruel treatment he faced planted seeds of despair. By the age of just 8 or 9, Nick was already wrestling with deep questions most children never think about. Why am I here? Why did God make me like this? Would the world even notice if I was gone? These thoughts became darker with time. He looked at his future and could not see anything but loneliness. The bullying did not just hurt his childhood, it shaped his identity, convincing him that he was broken beyond repair. And yet, hidden beneath the pain, something else was quietly growing. Every insult, every laugh, every rejection was unknowingly building resilience. Though Nick could not see it then, the cruelty he faced was shaping a strength that would one day stand before millions. The bullies thought they were breaking him, but in truth, they were forging the steel of his soul. For now, though, Nick only felt the pain, the rejection, and the loneliness of a boy who wanted nothing more than to be accepted. The cruelty of bullying became one of the darkest chapters of Nick's childhood, but it was also one of the most important. Because when life pushes you down again and again, you learn to either give up or rise stronger than ever. Nick had not yet learned how to rise, but his story was only beginning. The same boy who sat alone, mocked and rejected, would one day stand in front of thousands and teach the world the meaning of true acceptance and strength. The battle was far from over, but even in his pain, Nick's journey was preparing him for greatness. As Nick grew older, the weight of his struggles did not lighten, it grew heavier. The bullying at school, the loneliness on the playground, and the constant stares in public places had already left scars on his heart. But what hurt even more was the silent war inside him. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw not the person he wanted to be, but the body he wished he could change. He saw what he lacked instead of what he had. His reflection was a reminder of rejection, of being different, of being less in a world that celebrated beauty, strength, and perfection. And slowly, Nick's thoughts began to sink into the darkest corners of despair. By the time he was 10 years old, Nick no longer just felt sadness, he felt hopelessness. Sadness passes, but hopelessness eats away at the soul. He started to believe that his life had no value, that his future had no direction. He imagined himself growing up, unable to find a job, unable to marry, unable to build a life that resembled the ones he saw around him. The pain of imagining endless loneliness was unbearable. And with every passing day, the question became louder in his mind: why should I live at all? Nick remembers those years as some of the darkest moments of his life. He felt invisible to the world, yet painfully visible in his difference. Every cruel word from others seemed to echo endlessly, convincing him that they were right, that he was worthless, that he was a mistake. He began to wonder if ending his life would not only free him from pain but also release his parents from the burden of caring for him. These thoughts haunted him day and night, whispering to him that the easiest way out was to simply stop existing. At just 10 years old, Nick attempted suicide. He tried to drown himself in the family bathtub. He told himself that if life was going to be nothing but rejection and dependence, then there was no point in continuing. As the water rose around him, a terrifying thought struck him: the faces of his parents. He imagined his mother finding him, his father's heart breaking, their tears flowing not because of his condition but because of his choice to give up. That single thought stopped him. Love interrupted despair. The same love that had carried him since birth, the love that reminded him every day he mattered to someone, pulled him back from the edge. But surviving that moment did not erase the darkness. For years, Nick continued to wrestle with depression. He would smile on the outside but feel broken on the inside. He attended school, went through daily routines, and acted as though he was okay, but in his heart, he felt fragile. He wondered if the pain would ever go away, if the loneliness would ever end. Life felt like a long tunnel with no light at the end. And yet, deep inside, the seed of survival had been planted. That day in the bathtub, Nick had discovered one reason to live: love. He realized that even if he could not see his purpose, his life still mattered to the people who loved him. Those dark hours did not immediately transform him, but they taught him something vital: that as long as there was even one reason to live, giving up was not the answer. His journey through depression became one of the greatest battles of his life, and though it left scars, it also gave him strength. The boy who once wanted to die would one day tell millions how to live. Nick's darkest hours could have been his last, but instead, they became the foundation of his greatest message. He would later tell audiences, "If you don't get a miracle, you can become one." But before he could speak those words to the world, he first had to learn them himself. He had to face death in order to choose life. He had to confront the darkest hours of his soul to discover the light that still waited for him. And in that painful process, Nick Vujicic began the slow, powerful journey from hopelessness to hope. There comes a moment in many lives when a tiny idea lights a lantern in the dark, a moment so small at first that it almost goes unnoticed, yet later everything is measured from that instant forward. For Nick, that moment crept in as a thought: what if I start focusing on what I can do instead of what I cannot? It was not a grand revelation handed down from above, it was a quiet, stubborn whisper in the midst of sorrow. He began to experiment with his body, learning to use the small foot-like limb he had been given. What once felt like a cruel reminder of loss slowly became a tool, a means to take tiny steps toward independence. He practiced until his toes could hold a pencil, learned to type with painstaking patience, and discovered that with persistence even the smallest movements could produce meaningful action. Each small success, tying a shoelace, shaving with a modified razor, balancing a plate while carrying it across a room, tasted like victory. They were ordinary tasks to most, but for Nick each was a conquest over despair. These little wins brought confidence, and confidence brought curiosity. Instead of retreating from the world, he began to test it. He pushed at doors that once seemed locked and, bit by bit, watched them swing open. The seed of hope germinated into determination. He realized that limitations might shape his body, but they didn't have to define his spirit. And as that internal light grew, so too did his willingness to try things that terrified him. What had once been impossible now looked like a challenge he could meet with grit and faith. In the quiet of practice rooms and the patient encouragement of his parents, Nick discovered the first true source of power in his life: agency, the ability to act, to change, and to build. From that spark came a slow, steady blaze that would one day illuminate stages across the world. Learning to adapt was not a neat montage or an inspirational headline. It was long, repetitive, and sometimes humiliating work. Nick taught himself to write using his toes, pressing a pencil between them with a clumsy tenderness until words began to form. He learned to use a computer, type emails, and communicate without needing someone to speak for him. He practiced swimming for hours until the water no longer intimidated him. He learned to ride a modified board and felt the surge of freedom when waves supported him. Each new skill required invention, adaptive tools, modified techniques, and endless trial and error. There were setbacks that left him exhausted and moments when his progress felt invisible. Yet each failure taught innovation. He built routines that made daily life possible and then turned those routines into rituals of empowerment. Schoolwork became manageable because he refused to let limitations become excuses. He joined activities when possible, found small ways to contribute, and began to see himself not as an object of pity but as a participant in life's flow. His family and teachers adapted around him, but Nick did the real work. He learned to push past embarrassment, to keep trying when others would have quit, and to laugh at his mistakes. Over time, the adaptations multiplied into skills. He learned to surf, to skate on specially made boards, to swim strong and proud, and to perform tasks that many assumed impossible for someone in his body. Each adaptation was a statement. The human spirit writes solutions when given time, patience, and courage. In the quiet laboratories of practice, a kitchen table, a backyard pool, an after-school classroom, Nick quietly rewired his life. He turned limitations into experiments, and experiments into a new identity built on capability rather than lack. By the time he reached late adolescence, adaptation had transformed from survival strategy to a way of living boldly. At 17, Nick stepped onto a stage for the first time, his knees trembling and his heart pounding like a drum. He had rehearsed the words, but speeches are not rehearsed into truth, they are breathed into it by vulnerability. In front of a small audience of students, he spoke about fear, about the raw ache of being stared at, and about the long nights when hope felt like something other people had. He spoke about the small victories and the humiliations, about the bathtub that almost took him and the tiny hand of love that pulled him back. As he spoke, something remarkable happened. The audience stopped being a crowd and became a mirror. The students saw not a spectacle but a human being who had known the same emotions they had: shame, yearning, fear, only larger and more exposed. Tears formed in more than one pair of eyes. People who had never thought about the fragile scaffolding of courage found themselves inspired to examine their own lives. For Nick, that first speech was a metamorphosis. The stage was not a place where he performed, it was a place where he belonged. He discovered the strange, wonderful fact that telling the truth about pain can become a bridge to other hearts. From that point, speaking became a practice of service. He left the stage shaken but filled with the knowledge that pain, when shared, becomes power both for the teller and the listener. That first audience was small, but the ripple began there. Word traveled not because of charisma alone but because his authenticity resonated. The boy who had once hidden behind silence now realized that his voice could be a lifeline for others. He had found a purpose that fit the shape of his life. A single speech gave way to dozens, and dozens to hundreds. What started in school auditoriums grew into stadiums, church halls, and international conferences. Nick's message, rooted in honesty, humor, and